Hi guys, so I thought I'd do a quick video on my thoughts on the current state of the meta. Following recent tournaments in the US, and with lots of events coming up on the 4th of May, Star Wars Day, I thought it would be a good time to do a video discussing where the meta is currently and my predictions for how things will play out in the next few weeks and months, leading up to the release of Set 2. This isn't going to be a tier list video where I rank all of the main decks, mostly because I think the meta is still in a state of flux, and I think if I put something out saying, X, Y, Z are the best decks in the game, I think the video could be outdated within a week or two, and it would just be pointless. So instead I'm going to go through the 3 main archetypes, discuss which decks are being played in each, and then give a few tips if you're playing that style on how to deal with the different matchups. Overall, I think the health of the meta is very good. We're in a good state right now. We've got a good mixture of aggro, mid-range and control, and we can see the classic sort of TCG triangle in full swing. Aggro beats control, control beats mid-range, and mid-range beats aggro. So let's start with the current flavour of the month following the 5k tournament in Florida, control decks. So in terms of control decks, we currently have 2 main versions of this. Interestingly, all including some version of Blue Villain. We have the traditional control decks using either Krennic or Iden with a green base, the ramp package and a fair amount of removal, with some of the bigger late game bombs like Darth Vader to kind of close the game out. You could also swap either of those leaders for Palpatine running a blue base, as I discussed in one of my previous videos, see the link in the description. And then we have the new kid on the block, which is the blue-red decks, so either Iden and a red base or Vader and a blue base. These are the control decks which are primarily playing lots of removal spells and trying to stall the game until Super Laser Blast 8 resources, before flipping the leader and then playing Avenger and winning the game that way. They're playing early game Sentinels like Childson to try and stretch the game longer as well. With Vader, he kind of is an alternative win condition. So, as I mentioned a minute ago, in terms of matchups, these decks are really heavily favoured against any kind of mid-range deck. So things like Boba Fett, Luke Command, Chirrut Red, all of which decks that we'll discuss later on. If you watch the VOD of the finals of the Orlando 5k, you get a really good example of why these decks are so heavily favoured. It was a really one-sided match, and it felt like the control player won quite easily in the end. So why is that? Essentially the mid-range decks are not fast enough to go under the control decks, and they don't have as powerful late-game package to match them in the long run either. So they end up getting controlled in the early game and then out-resourced in the late game. So if you're playing a control deck and you're up against mid-range, you're already favoured, but is there anything that you can specifically do in that matchup to increase your win rate? Other than some good early removal, the key thing to look for obviously is Super Laser Blast, because that's the card that's going to win the match in the end above all others. In the first 5 turns, you're going to inevitably draw a good amount of removal as you run so much in the deck, so you should only be falling behind a bit by the mid to late game. If you've been smart and you've drawn and held on to Super Laser Blast, when you play that down, you essentially win the game on that turn. There's not really any specific cards to sideboard against these mid-range decks because the deck is already designed to beat them and it's such a one-sided matchup. But then we come on to the weakness of these control decks, and that's aggro. So I'm talking about decks like Sabine Red, Sabine Yellow, Leia Red, Boba Yellow. These decks move really fast and they play so many things that can go underneath the control deck and sort of eke out enough damage to win the game. The problem for the control deck and the control player, if you're playing these decks, is that most of the removal in the game, with the exception of a very few limited cards, I think I can probably list them off the top of my head: Bombing Run, Overwhelming Barrage, Super Laser Blast, and the Palpatine unit. Most of the removal in the game, apart from those ones I've just mentioned, are single target in nature. So when the aggro decks are playing down 1, 2, 3 things a turn, it can be quite difficult for the control player to keep up and remove everything that your opponent's doing. It's also a hard matchup because the aggro player has a lot of synergies and other ways to deal damage, and they've got quite a lot of reach cards. What do I mean by reach cards? I mean cards like K2SO or Fight for Freedom or For a Cause I Believe In, cards that inevitably deal damage. So over the course of the game, let's just suppose you're playing against a Sabine player, an aggro deck. They have 3 K2SOs, 3 For a Cause I Believe In, which together equal, what's that? So K2SO is at least 3 damage each, so 9 damage. And 4 cores I believe in, 3 of them, maximum is 12. So you're looking at inevitable 21 damage that Sabine player is going to do to you over the course of the game. So it's really difficult to stop that from happening. What you need to do as the control player against aggro is you need to minimize the amount of damage that you're taking in the early game, because if the aggro player gets in just a little bit too much with a bit of reach in the mid to late game, with some of those cards I've mentioned, you'll lose the game. So you have to use your removal really wisely, obviously. But the other thing is you have to kind of race the aggro player. So you have to remove things, find your Sentinels, so Childson in the mid game, and then you need to make it to the late game. And then when you deploy your Vader, if you're playing Vader Blue, you then need to essentially race the aggro player. The other thing to be aware of when you're playing against aggro as a control player is to be aware of surprise damage from hand. Some of the biggest culprits are things like Rebel Assault, Heroic Sacrifice, Surprise Strike. There's not always something you can do about these, but if you can try and play around them and consider them, you should always consider the possibility that your opponent's holding onto one of these as well. So when deciding on what to mulligan against aggro, you basically need to find a sentinel unit. So hard mulligan for something like Chardson or System Patrol Craft if your opponent's going into space. If you suspect your opponent's going into space, then that's really important, because often a removal card is going to remove one card, right? So if you play Open Fire and you remove an Echo-based Defender, that's a 1-for-1 trade. But if you play Chardson and he's a 5-5 or a 6-6, quite often your opponent's going to have to send 2 or even 3 things into Chardson to get through him. So that's a 3-for-1 trade, so that's much more efficient. So actually I think in the next set when we have more Sentinel cards, the control decks are actually going to probably get a bit better. So it's obviously quite hard. Another thing that the aggro players might do, and the smart ones will do this, is they will arena dodge you. So if you start playing down Sentinel units and units in the ground arena, they'll probably start playing things in the space arena as well. So you have to be aware of that and anticipate what the deck you're facing is going to try and do. When deciding what to sideboard against aggro as the control player, you're looking to take out some of your late game stuff like Avenger, because you're probably not going to make it that long. You can maybe keep 1 in, but don't be running 3 Avengers against an aggro deck. And with ramp, you have to be really careful. You can keep it in, obviously, if you're running a green control list. Ramp can be really good against certain decks, but if you're playing a resupply on turn 2 against Sabine, you've essentially wasted your turn. You've done nothing, and they've probably advanced their board state by quite a lot by that point. Other cards which are quite useful to sideboard in against aggro are cards like Repair. Repair is a very strong card. It's quite undervalued in the meta. I think it's quite a simple card. It's not very flashy. But for 1 cost, you're basically removing 3 damage from your opponent, which is nearly completely negating their 4 cores if you think about it. So if you run 3 of these, that's 9 damage healed over the course of the game, which if they played 3 4 cores and then get 4 damage on each, they've only done 3 damage. Other cards to tech in against aggro, things like a Devotion, which can give you some really good healing over the course of the game. Put a Devotion on Inferno 4 and then just swing away, and your opponent has to deal with it because that 4 damage swing every turn is just too much. Overall, it's going to be a difficult matchup for the control player playing against aggro, but it's definitely winnable with the right card techs and a decent draw. Now we move on to mid-range. So is mid-range dead now because of the advent of control? Probably not. It feels like in the early days of the meta following the game's release, Boba was the undisputed king. Because of that, he was sort of single-handedly keeping in check all of the aggro decks, which meant, despite the fact that a lot of people were playing Sabine, she's actually still yet to win anything big, probably because of Boba. But now, with the discovery of these new true control decks, we're going to see a lot more aggro, and therefore, as a response to that, mid-range decks like Boba probably will still continue to be really good because they prey on these aggro decks massively. So the most popular current examples of mid-range decks that I can think of are Boba Green, Luke Green, Chirrut Red, and then some sort of weirder niche decks like Han Green, things like that. So the favoured matchup for mid-range decks is aggro. Are there any key cards in this matchup? Not particularly. I think you're pretty much favoured regardless. Aggro decks can go fast and go underneath the mid-range decks, but I think if you're playing something like Boba Green, a really important thing to do is play a little bit of early game removal, match them 1-for-1 with minions. So if they play down Sabine in the ground arena, you want to play down something like Viper Probe Droid in the ground arena. You don't want to be playing a 2-3 that doesn't trade against Sabine. So you kind of need to initially play as the control player and remove early, and then later on in the game you should be winning by deploying your bigger things and running in things like Steadfast Battalion into Sabine, stuff like that. I don't think the matchup is as favoured as much as control is favoured over mid-range, but it's still a favourable matchup for you as the mid-range player. Now for the weakness of the deck, control. So unfortunately, with the coming of these new control decks, obviously this is going to become a more prevalent matchup for Boba and other mid-range decks. Those mid-range decks like Boba, Luke, Chirrut definitely struggle against control. The only chance you have as the mid-range player of winning this matchup is to play as aggressively as possible and hope that the control player doesn't draw the correct move at the right time. You have to try to go under them, because if the game's going to go long, the control player is just going to be able to reset the board to Super Laser Blast and then play down big things like Avenger, and Palpatine, which both just sort of close the game out. There's nothing you can do at that point. So key sideboard tech for mid-range decks against control are more late game cards that help to swing the game. So stuff like putting Relentless into Green Boba. If Green Boba can ramp up into Relentless before the control player can play something like Super Laser Blast, that can be game winning, because once Relentless is on the board, they can't actually play Super Laser Blast without playing a different event first. So they'd have to have 2 events in hand. One is cheap enough to play alongside Super Laser Blast, so it kind of locks the game down. The only answer at that point would probably be Avenger, but you can play around that by playing multiple minions on the board. So yeah, in hero decks, other things that you can tech in against control are more sort of late game cards like Mace Windu, who, although is one of the weaker legendaries, he's just a big body that needs to be answered. Or in any yellow deck, teching in Change of Heart is quite good against control because you can steal their big thing and then hit them in the face with it. And then lastly, you can, it's a hero deck, you can tech in U-Wing Reinforcements to reset the board after they've blown up your board. So the matchup going mid-range against control is really difficult one to win, but if you go aggressive, you play your things, come out as quickly as possible, or you ramp up into something like Relentless, then it is definitely winnable. And lastly, we've got aggro. So aggro is back, and it kind of never went anywhere. Sabine and Leia have always been played. I mean, I don't know about you guys, but in my local game store, people have been playing Sabine and Leia every single week that I've gone since the game released. Aggressive decks like Green Sabine, Red Leia, Yellow Sabine, they're all really strong. They've always been strong. They've just been held in check by Boba Fett, essentially. So, however, with the new wave of blue villain control decks like Vader and Iden, playing cards like Vigilance and Avenger, which are just really slow and late game, the aggro decks are really going to come back with a vengeance, I think. If you're playing an aggro deck, you're really strongly favoured against these control decks. However, the mid-range matchup is going to be a challenge for you. But with the right techs, it's winnable. So you can kind of keep your favourable matchup against control decks, and you can improve your matchup slightly against the mid-range decks with a few adjustments. And having said that your matchup against mid-range is unfavourable, I still think aggro can win against Boba more than Boba can win against control, if that makes sense. Because sometimes you're just going to play faster than the mid-range deck. They're just not going to be able to do anything about it. So to tech against mid-range, I think the most important thing to remember as the aggressive player against Boba and other mid-range decks is you need to outpace them, essentially. So you need to be playing stuff and then claiming the initiative as a priority. You're not going to outvalue them in the long run. You just need to race them down before they can get to those later turns and play down things like Darth Vader or Steadfast Battalion. So there's no point really teching in, more late game cards, because then you're just going to dilute your strategy. So you need to go all in on the aggro, try and kill them before they can make an impact on the board. So flood the board and then kill them in the long run. That's probably your best strategy, I think. And what about against control? So there are a few specific things. I mean, you're very favoured against control anyway because they're so slow that you should be winning that matchup. I think the newer control decks, you're going to have a bit of a harder time against them. But on the whole, they're only removing one thing a turn. Cards like Power of the Dark Side, Open Fire. The only real sort of new strategy that they have, well, 2 new strategies they have. One is Childson. So you need to have a plan in place to get through Childson. Whether that's using Heroic Strike or a Fleet Lieutenant, send something smaller into him. You just need to be aware that you're going to probably see him on turn 3 and you need to get through him. And then the other new strategy they have is Vigilance, which gives them 5 healing, which is obviously very strong, but it costs 6 resources in their deck. So it's quite slow. So hopefully by then you'll have pulled away a little bit and you just need to get enough damage in so that your reach cards can finish them off in the late game. Few specific cards that you can tech in against things like this are obviously Wolf. He can stop healing on a phase and whenever he attacks as well, so he's really good to stop your opponent from using cards like Vigilance to heal. Heroic Sacrifice is really good against control because it gives you more damage, it gives you more cards, it replaces itself by drawing a card, and also your opponent is likely going to kill your things anyway with their removal, so you may as well get a bit more damage in and draw a card with it. And lastly, you can play things like U-Wing Reinforcements to reflood the board after they've used that board wipe. So that might be something that you want to bring in against a control deck. So what are my overall thoughts on the current state of the meta and what am I going to be doing in the next few weeks? So I think the meta is really healthy. As I said earlier, we really do have a triangle of viability where we have control decks that are good, mid-range decks that are good, and aggro decks that are good. And that's kind of what you want, because you want people to be reactive in the meta. So so that you can play everything. It means that technically all of these styles are viable, and we have a lot of different heroes that are viable as well. So it's a good sign of a healthy meta, and it doesn't feel like any one deck is completely dominant, because if lots of people start playing these blue control decks, then the aggro players will start doing better, and then when the aggro players start doing better, the mid-range players will start doing better. So it kind of, it rotates like that. But what it does feel like to me, if you're going to a tournament in the next few weeks, I think aggro is probably going to be the right pick. Obviously, this depends on your local meta, where you play, what people are playing. If everyone in your local game store is playing Boba Fett, maybe not. But if people are going to be trying these new control decks, which I've seen a lot of people buying, Vigilance and Avenger and Super Laser Blast on Card Market recently and on Facebook, I think now's a really good time to jump into Sabine. Green Sabine or Yellow Sabine, both really good matchups against that deck. And actually, Double Red Sabine apparently has a really good matchup against it. So that deck is, I don't have all the cards for Double Red Sabine, I don't have 3 aggressions, but if you do, that might be worth something worth thinking about. What am I going to be doing? So I've got, on May the 4th, I've got my local game store is running just a small tournament, and I've looked through all the meta, and I've built the blue control Vader list, I've built the red Sabine list, and I've built an Emperor Palpatine list as well, control. But I think the thing that I've landed on, and I'm kind of giving the game away here a bit, is that I'm going to be playing mono yellow Boba Fett. And I think my reasoning is this, basically. It's an aggro deck, so it has a really good matchup against control. So it goes very fast. We play a lot of Surprise Strike and Cunning, which give you 3 and 4 attack extra, respectively. It can surprise people, it can really push a lot more damage. And cards like Childson, which they're depending on, are really weak to things like Cantina Bouncer and Waylay, because you can just bounce them, and Cunning as well, for that matter. So Cunning can kind of get around Childson in one go. You can give one of your units +4 and then bounce Childson in one card. So very strong against that deck. It also has a really good matchup against Sabine and Leia, because you're picking off their things whilst getting your own plan in action. So Cantina Bouncer, Cunning, Bodhi Rook, you can get rid of their events. So it kind of, and then the Space Arena, 7th Fleet Defender, trades really well into A-Wings, things like that. So the only matchup that feels bad as the mono yellow Boba player is the green Boba list, essentially. Not many people play that deck in my meta. I think one person has brought it to an event before, and I managed to avoid him that time. So I don't know, I'll have to see how it goes with that one. But yeah, that's just my meta pick. Obviously, if you're going to a tournament or an event around you, have a think about what people you know are playing and try and, tech against them and play something which will play to your strengths against those decks. But yeah, let me know how you get on. I'll let you know how I get on at my tournament it's on Saturday, so I'll probably post another video next week just discussing my results, and I'll let you know how I did. Anyway, thanks for listening. See you next time.